afternoon, good evening, folks. Greetings from Seattle. Sorry not to be there in person. I wish I could be there, having a Sam Adams or another hoppy beer from Boston, but we'll save it for next time. First off, thank you to Vivli and ADDI for hosting this, and congratulations on your data sharing partnership. And I want to also thank all the panelists, Murali, Lon, Phyllis, Rebecca, and Tetsu. Without further delay, why don't I jump in and start with a question to Lon. Lon, great presentation and overview on Vivli. It's great to see from a user's perspective how they could go about accessing data sets, requesting data sets. But data sharing is only a first great step. And I emphasize it's a first step. Many users are unable to leverage those data sets to generate novel insights due to other challenges, whether it's harmonization, interoperability, lack of a compute space, et cetera. And you touched on some of those elements in your presentation. Can you elaborate a little bit more? Could those be overcome? If so, how should a user go about it?
Sure. So with regards to interoperability, I think you see both the advantages and the potential challenge if you're bringing down databases from Pfizer and Takeda. You've got to do a little work to merge them together in order to use them together. However, the advantages of that, the advantages of bringing and combining databases on this platform are to do studies, are to, for instance, be able to look at secular trends, let's say in changes in placebo outcomes or longitudinal analyses by using sequential cohorts, or to address the various controversies in Alzheimer trials, such as variation and heterogeneity within trials and over time. So those are some examples, and just one counter example is we've been funded for years to work on doing trial simulations with pooled data sets, but the pooled data sets we have are only academic data sets from the Alzheimer's Disease Cooperative Study. So we have about 16 or so, but that is limited, and there's a limit to what you can do. So,
thank you, Lon. Let me go to Murali next. And Murali, good to see you. And I'm curious, from your perspective, what are some of the questions or unanswered questions in the field, Alzheimer's related dementias, that could potentially be answered with greater data sharing and secondary analyses?
Well, hello, everyone. Thanks, Niranjan, and thank you, Vivli and ADDI, for having me. I could spend the next 2 hours answering that question. I think Vivli and ADDI are going to be powerful new tools with potential to impact almost every aspect of clinical drug development in AD. If you just look at the pandemic, we have vaccines, we have tests because of rapid data sharing and public-private partnerships. Without that, we would not have. If you look at the last 10, 15 genes that were discovered in Alzheimer's, it's because of data sharing. In small data sets, you cannot make genetic discoveries. And likewise, if you look at virtually all the clinical trials that were presented at this meeting, they learned from previous clinical trials, and they were able to gain insights from ADNI, and studies like ADNI in Europe and Australia that made their data sets available publicly so that others could mine it for insights. So let's take some specific examples, right? Do we know enough about differences between men and women in Alzheimer's disease? We don't. Could someone pull individual level data from Vivli, do what's called as a network meta-analysis, and those types of sophisticated analysis to see, do women and men differ in how they progress, how they respond to drugs, their propensity for side effects to different classes of drugs? Likewise, with minorities and underrepresented populations, we know very little because each study by itself, maybe 10, 15% of the sample is underrepresented minorities. Could we somehow pool data from different studies? 2-3 years from now, fast forwarding, we're going to hopefully have a number of disease-modifying therapies. Each one of them would not have compared the active treatment versus some other company's active treatment. Could we use these kinds of data sets to do indirect comparisons of the efficacy, of the safety? We know that immunotherapies can potentially result in ARIA. We know that ApoE4 is linked to ARIA, but could we use artificial intelligence to identify other risk factors, such as vascular risks, such as a combination of labs, things that are invisible to us currently with traditional techniques with individual studies? So these are some examples, I think, of the power that this kind of a data platform offers.
Well, thank you, Murali. Speaking of data sets and more specifically industry-sponsored trials, let me turn to Phyllis. And Phyllis, Lilly has been an exemplar when it comes to data sharing, especially of the studies that Lilly, has sponsored. What are some of the drivers and decision points that leads Lilly to come forward and share the data sets? And if you could speak more broadly to the industry mindset, be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Thanks, Bose. And can we just pause for a minute and be like, how cool is this? That like not only are we all together in Boston, but Tetsu's with us in Japan and Bose is with us on the West Coast. Like seriously, I hope that this is something that we really hold on to post-pandemic, because we never would have tried to do this before. It's pretty cool. And
although
Tetsu,
Phyllis, we would also like a beer or a wine too.
And we're drinking beer and wine. Yes, even better, or I'm not, but I will. So I think, asked the industry perspective, for Lilly specifically, which is the seat that I can speak from, we have a pretty significant set of company values around data transparency and data sharing. So that's both in when we publish data and that we publish all the data, but also in data sharing. And that looks a couple of different ways. We do have a partnership with Vivli across all of our therapeutic areas and have worked very closely with them to make sure that studies are just very routinely now, almost as a matter of course, we have a data transparency team whose job it is to keep those data at a certain time flowing onto Vivli. But also, long relationship with the Alzheimer's Disease Cooperative Study, which Lon mentioned. In the face of Alzheimer's disease, we believe strongly that we all have to work together to fight this battle. I think specifically to ADDI, and one of the things that I really like about the workbench and why Lilly's really excited about the Vivli partnership is really the democratization of that data. So it's not easy to get data out of a big pharma company and into some sort of usable platform that anyone could get access to. And we know that we need more young researchers. We know we want more people involved. And the beauty of the workbench is that it really does allow anybody to get into that data and work on it. So why would we care? Well, I'll talk about the JERIS data set, which is the data set that we recently loaded directly onto ADDI. So the JERIS data set is, and for those of you that don't know, JERIS is the god of aging. Does not actually stand for something, although I do get asked that a lot. It's actually 4 data sets. 2 large data sets from Europe, a Japan data set and a US data set. And it is probably, if not the largest, one of the largest real-world evidence observational data sets in Alzheimer's disease. So it's not an interventional study. However, it is really prime data to be interrogated lots of different ways. And specifically, with lots of different people. So does that mean they're looking now across countries? Does it mean they're looking within country but asking different questions, maybe that we didn't interrogate the data with? And what the workbench allows us to do is to share the data once, and then we can partner with others in that data. So when the European data set was published several years ago, we had to take requests from scientists, and then our statistical team would have to actually do that analysis. That's a very high resource intensive type of process. This way, we can put that data on the workbench, and then say our Japan team wants to do a collaboration with someone on their JERIS Japan data set, they can go in and do it together on that workbench. That's the Lilly Japan team. So it actually allows us both for, what we believe is the solution, which is the data sharing and everybody working on things together and lots of folks interrogating, but it's also an efficiency play for us because now that data is there and we don't have to do multiple data transfers.
Well, thank you, Phyllis. Let me ask a similar question to Rebecca. Rebecca, from your perspective and Vivli's perspective, what do you believe are some of the drivers and decision criteria that academics and industry data contributors use before they share data in your platform?
Thanks for the question, Bo. So we do see that the drivers for academics are slightly different than those for industry. So academics have been driven by the fact that journals and funders are increasingly having different data sharing mandates and requirements. We do see that the NIH's data sharing policy, which will move in 2023, has already nudged some academics to start sharing on Vivli, which has been quite interesting for us. We do see that industry has, of course, the Trade Association Pharma FPIA, and that has moved some of them. I feel like industry's more on the leading edge of data sharing, and that has not been a nudge for academics, of course. But one thing that they do have in common, I believe, is that both of them do want to move the science forward. So scientific insights, driving the science has been an overlap in terms of why both groups want to share, and that is something that they have in common. So that's really where I think in terms of the incentives overlap.
Great, thank you. And last but not least, Tetsu, coming to you, what, in your opinion, can be done to drive more of the reuse of data and data sets?
Yeah, thanks, Bo. Obviously, this is something we're thinking about all the time. So what everybody's talked about so far is basically how we can lead scientists to the data flow, and now the question is how can we encourage them to drink once they get there from the data flow in this case. And some of the things I think that are important have been mentioned already by other people on the panel. Obviously make data available, and where you can, make good data available, because there is always going to be some effort involved, however much we lower the barrier for people using the data and knowing that the data are good, knowing that they are high quality, knowing that they are protecting research participants' privacy. All of these things are going to make it more likely that people are going to reuse data. Secondly, you have to make it easy to use. And again, we've heard from Lon, from Rebecca, from others about data harmonization. If you want to bring several studies together and make best use of them, you do not want to spend months trying to align the dictionaries and terms so that you're really doing this properly. Tools, and whether those tools are for hardened data scientists who want to write everything in machine language, or whether they are for scientists or even people with dementia or their carers who just want to explore and understand, we need to have the tools available for all of them. And as we've mentioned any number of times here, global sharing is important. Alzheimer's disease and dementias and it strikes everywhere across the planet, and the solutions from it is going to come from everywhere. So making sure that people can use those data wherever they are is going to increase the use. ADDI through the AD Workbench has committed to making that access free to users, and that's another point. If you have to write a large grant every time you want to do a study to reuse data, it's going to discourage your doing that, or limit it to the number of people who have resources to do it, which isn't what we want to do. And I think the last thing we want to do to encourage reuse is create exemplars by publishing, so that the value of reusing data becomes clear to researchers. And again, that's whether they're data scientists, neuroscientists, other kinds of scientists, just smart people who want to move into the field. Being able to see what you can do with that makes you think, oh, I have an idea that I could approach using those kinds of data as well. And that creates a virtuous circle, because then the data set owners, many of whom are not as bold and committed as Phyllis and her team at Lilly may be, can see there's an incentive for us to share our best data because we and others are going to get good answers that way that are going to move the whole field forward.
Great. Thank you, Tetsu. And perhaps, Rebecca, we could start taking any questions from the in-person audience. And before the first question comes from the live audience, I have one from the virtual attendees. And Rebecca, this is to you. I think the question is, what's the approximate turnaround time from a request to approval? And is there a cost associated with access to the data to a user?
Yes, thank you so much for the question. So the approximate turnaround time from request to approval can be from weeks to a month. It's fairly quick. Access can take a couple months because there are legal agreements that need to be signed. So it depends on whether that person's institution already has a master agreement signed with us. So I think in terms of access, so access to the data is free. So we do not charge for access to the data. The data use agreement is for the period of 1 year. After a period of a year, there is a nominal cost to access if that is accessed in the secure research environment, and that is simply to offset the cost of the licensed software, and that is a nominal cost of about $15 a day. So that's all available on our website. So thank you for the question. I do believe we have a question in the room.
Wilhelmson from the Rockefeller Neuroscience Institute.
Can we turn on the mics in the room just a little bit louder, please? Thank you.
Testing.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm Kirk Wilhelmson from the Rockefeller Neuroscience Institute.
Want to get closer to the microphone?
I'm Kirk Wilhelmson from the Rockefeller Neuroscience Institute, and half the variance of the risk for Alzheimer's is genetic. Do you have a plan in ADDI and Vivli to deal with genetic data?
Tetsu, would you like to take that, or would you like me to take it?
Grab that. Thank you for that. So, and it's a great point that allows me to say that we're welcoming all kinds of human data onto the AD workbench. So where contributors are have as part of their study genetic data, where individuals who have genetic data that they'd like to share would like to do so, we can share that in pretty much any format that you like. Although obviously genetic data, as with, for example, imaging data, voice data, are very sensitive in terms of personally identifiable information. And so there is some care that we need to take through our platform partners and through data contributors to ensure that those data are used safely. But wherever they can be used, wherever they can be included in generating or testing hypotheses, we want to make all those data available.
Kurt, do you need to follow up?
I was going to ask a second. Hello? I was going to ask a secondary question, and that genetics is about samples too, and access to samples that have been collected for industry and trials are extremely valuable. And the question is there a plan to go further?
I'm going to kick this one over to Bose, actually.
Well, yeah, I'm happy to take a shot at it and welcome all of the other panelists to chime in as well. Now, a fantastic question. And here I'm going to draw upon the Diagnostics Accelerator, which is a partnership between the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation, ADDF, and a host of other co-funders, including ourselves, Gates Ventures. So thanks to at least 3 industry sponsors, we have biobanking agreements to make samples broadly available. Us at Gates Ventures, we have partnerships with the Swedish Biofinder team, the Banner Institute, and the GAP Hermes program, and a few others that are in the works to, again, make these valuable samples available, accessible to the broader community. And I think part of your question also goes to, one is sample access. The second is transparency, visibility as to where they are available, how to access them, and more importantly, how do you also get access to the data that accompanies those samples? And that absolutely is something that we're actively working with a coalition of partners on, trying to see if that's something we can work with ADDI, the Diagnostics Accelerator, and a host of other industry sponsors in bringing forward. Welcome ideas, welcome additional input from the panel members as well.
Yes, hi. Imaging was mentioned, and so I was wondering a little bit like Annie, what proportion, well, first, is imaging part of Vivli and ADDI, and out of the 6,000 plus trials, what proportion of them have a bit of imaging in them?
Thank you for the question. I do realize how important imaging is for the Alzheimer's community. Let me just tell you that it has been a challenge for us. I mean, images are, of course, much larger than clinical trial data in terms of the memory. That is on a roadmap for us in future development. Right now, we do not include imaging data in our platform, but we do anticipate that that would be a future development for us. I'll hand it over to Tetsu for him to reply for ADDI.
Can I just add to?
Of course.
So this database and platform is what it is, and it's focused on clinical trials. There are other platforms that take contributions of imaging data. So from USC, so I have to mention Arthur Toga's overview of a platform called GAIN, which emphasizes actual imaging, and of course there's ADNI, although ADNI is just one study, one cohort.
I'm happy to jump in again, although I saw Phyllis's hand on the microphone too. But I would say, yeah, I mean, hosting raw imaging data is challenging, as Rebecca has said, particularly if it scales up. One way of getting around that is to say that, because we're working with interoperability, because we're basically linking data sets, that imaging intensive data sets can share derived data, which then can be linked to clinical data, linked to other biomarkers, either existing or developing. And I think you'll get most, if not all, of the functionality from those data as we intend to use them that way. Where the only way for imaging data to be shared with the community is for us to find a way to work with partners to store that, to share that, to anonymize it. We'll work towards doing that. But as of today, we don't have examples of ADDI doing that.
Yeah, and I think, Tetsu, I'd build on that. And actually, the answer is very similar for the imaging data as it is for the biomarker samples. And that is, a biomarker sample is a physical sample. There are lots of challenges with doing that, not the least of which is the shelf life of the sample. But when we can get that data into the data set and fully characterized, as we now can with imaging data as well, the hope is that that will actually be able to provide researchers with those fully characterized data sets. I think one of the things that it really forces us to do, though, as a community, is to really get standards in place about how we evaluate these. So obviously, Lily has our fantastic team at Avid Radiopharmaceuticals. The Amavid and Talvid data will be on Vivli. And but that group has been working hard with things like scintilloid measures and how do we measure different regions and how do we do that in a standard way so that we can compare across, in that case, amyloid tracers, but also be using standards so that data can get into a data set without having these just huge actual imaging files that have both technical challenges as well as privacy challenges. And so I think that's where we can come together as a community and agree on one way to interpret some of these things so that we can all use them.
Hi, Valerie Pavlik from Baylor College of Medicine. My question is more practical and has to do with, understanding the nature of the resource. So I wonder if there are guidelines for minimum data that should be posted in clinical trials. And I'll give an example of the Tomorrow study, which had genetic screening guidelines. And to my mind, the most useful data set would include the results of those genetic tests. So I wonder what we could expect to find there from clinical trial results.
Sure. So your question is, what is the minimum data that would be?
Yeah. So there's the principal results, and then there are various sub-studies and so on and so forth. And if I were to think about, looking at a trial or combining trials, is there an easy way for me to understand what has been loaded for a particular trial? Or is there some standard set of variables that you say you have to include? And if not, then how can we understand where to find, trials that have posted, like genetic screening results and so forth?
Yeah, so primarily that is found in what we call the data dictionary. And sometimes the member or sponsor will provide that ahead of time if you request it, so you can know what you'll be getting in the data set.
And is there an opportunity to ask the sponsor to add a variable?
I'm sorry.
So if, for example, again, the Tomorrow study is one that comes to mind because I was involved in that.
Yes.
The data set for me would not be complete without the results of the initial genetic tests that allocated people. So if the data set I find on Vivli doesn't have those data, can I request them? Can I say, is there any possibility?
Yes, if you want to request not just the primary study, but the sub-study, you certainly can request that. Okay. And they can let you know if that would be made available. Thank you.
But I think this data standard, data dictionary is really an important piece. And it's one of the things I think we learned when we even put the JERIS data set on ADDI. And shame on us, it was 4 Lilly studies, and we had used different data dictionaries for all 4 studies. And that was just at Lilly. Imagine. And so I think when we think about where we are from a maturity perspective as a field, it's these kinds of things that we can, they may not be sexy, right? They may not be the sexy stuff to talk about, but these are the kinds of things that if we start getting some alignment on standards, how are we going to call things, they're going to make life easier for everyone. And that's one of the things that actually ADDI helped us when we loaded the JERIS data set, because we kind of just dumped the stuff over. And then the ADDI team said, we need to make sure that this is accessible for people who don't know the data set as well as you do. So we really went back and cleaned up the data dictionary and things like that.
That was a great partnership, Phyllis, and an awful lot learned on both sides through that process. There was a terrific question from the floor. I'm sorry, those of us online can't see the questioners, but could hear that. In terms of what's included, obviously both Vivli and ADDI are committed to putting as much data as we possibly can out there. So when we're working with a sponsor, whether it's industry or academia, we are encouraging them to share everything. And because I happen to know the Tomorrow study a little bit as well, I would say, for example, I would love to see the recruitment data around that, because it was a tremendous effort to recruit and screen a huge number of subjects, and some of the data around screen failure, screen success, et cetera, would be really valuable to people who are trying to design prospective type clinical trials in the future. But ultimately, that decision of what to share comes from the data owner, the people who collected the data and the people who are sharing it with us. So we want to work with great organizations like Lilly, like Takeda, to make sure, and can bring in others as well. So ADDI has actually been working with the Duke Clinical Research Institute in order to curate that Tomorrow data set to make it more accessible, more visible, and more available. And where that's necessary, we certainly want to step in and help that happen too.
This is Kathy Welsh-Bomer from Duke. That's a great segue, Tetsu. So the Tomorrow data set is on Vivli, as you pointed out, and that's the entire clinical trial data set, as well as the validation studies are there as well, so for the various languages. One question that I had, so I'm obviously very familiar both with ADDI and with Vivli. One of the things that I find very appealing is the capability of leaving some of the tools that you develop for future researchers. So for example, if I were to derive some interesting new composite, neuropsychological composite measure, rather than me having to take that measure and just put it in a publication, the ability to leave that programming language on a workbench so a future researcher could use that same programming and not have to go back and read the publication and figure out how to do it. I wonder if you could comment about the ability to share derived tools or programming languages for future researchers who might come onto the platform and want to do a study looking, as I say, like at a unique composite that somebody else had published, whether that would be available.
Tetsu, did you want to take that, or would you like me to?
I'm very happy to start with it, and I'm sure you'll follow up, Rebecca, as well. Yes, Kathy, that's exactly what we want to do. Certainly, in a case where ADDI, for example, might sponsor individuals to develop new tools, and we've done that initially through an RFP. We may do more of that in the future. We want those tools to be available on the workbench, but even beyond that, any users who wish to share tools that they've developed, ontologies that they've developed, we want that to become available to everybody, and that's easily done through the AD workbench. It's part of the community that we want to build. It's not just a community of people who are contributing data and people who are publishing data. It's a community of people who want to help other people use data in just exactly the way you've described.
And let me address that as well. That is something that we would very much like to do. We're certainly working through the governance of that, as that's very much intertwined with the data itself. So that's something that I think it's really important for us to do as well, because I think it would save a great amount of work for the researchers on the platform. Thank you for the question. Yes.
Hi, Kent Hendricks, Pentara Data Management. My question is, a lot of has been talked about using standards. I mean, industry standards are now CDISC, SDTM, and ATOM. How much of what's on Vivli now is in SDTM and ATOM, and is there an active effort to nudge contributors into those standards?
Yeah, that's a great question. When we launched Vivli 3 years ago, we had the conundrum of whether we should mandate that all data be in SDTM or CDISC standards. For those of you who don't know what that is, I mean, it's and we decided that we would not do so, for the simple reason that we really wanted to lower the barrier for data sharing. There's, the vast majority of industry data coming on Vivli certainly is in standardized format, SDTM or ATOM, but some of the older data is not, and we really felt that that data was really greatly valuable. Many of the academic data sets are not in standardized format, but we still value that data. We did want to incentivize academics to share. So I would say the vast majority of the industry data sets are coming on in SDTM, and we anticipate more and more of the academic data sets perhaps to come on in a standardized format if those disease areas have a standardized vocabulary. I know that's not probably the precise answer that you're looking for. But are there any questions, Bose, online that have filtered through? I didn't want to forget about
nothing online here. But...
Okay, so we have a few more questions to the right of the.
Hello.
Yes.
Alex White, Progressive Medical Research. I'm a site. Probably not the best place maybe to ask this question, take up your time. Although when we saw collaboration about research, we thought, okay, here's a good opportunity. My sub and I were talking. Could this be a pathway? If not the pathway, what is a pathway for collaboration on combination therapies between pharmaceutical companies or researchers? Because it seems that, yes, there are some really, really positive data on some of the drugs that we're looking at, but a combination approach will probably be the best approach. Is that going to be an aftermarket thing once there are several on the market? Or could this collaboration of data lead to a collaboration between entities to bring a combination to the market?
Phyllis?
I was gonna toss it to Lon. You know, I think the question about combination therapy has come up for a long time, but even some here recently, Alex, so thanks for the question. There's obviously some, regulatory considerations on how you do that. Do you need to validate one molecule before you add another? There are, I think, some other therapeutic areas like oncology where we've got a role model for moving forward. My strategy is to work for a company that has a broad enough pipeline that I don't have to negotiate between two companies to make that happen. Because I think that the scientific challenges are difficult enough before you add in all of the kind of the business and the negotiation challenges. So many of you will know we actually did have a combination arm in Trailblazer 2 or in Trailblazer 1, and we had to actually bring that down because it had a BACE inhibitor in there. So I think it's very possible to do it. The research roundtable that is led by the Alzheimer's Association has actually had several conversations about this so that we can work with regulators across the industry sponsors to be able to talk about how to do it from a regulatory perspective. But it's still easier when you can do it within one company, and quite glad that Lilly has multiple mechanisms in our pipeline. So if we did figure out our best way of doing it, I'm sure we will, we can do it without necessarily having to negotiate between companies, because that does make it much more difficult.
So I will answer that in a slightly different way. If a data sharing platform like this has fluid samples, for example, across different trials involving different therapeutic mechanisms, then one can take those fluid samples and analyze them for metabolic signatures of each of the different drugs. And if you get signatures from different drugs that might suggest a synergy, then that could be a way of sort of making a rational argument for combining those two classes of drugs. So there's actually a large Alzheimer's disease metabolomic atlas that has just been published, where companies can simulate and plug in different drugs with different mechanisms of action to see which two drug combinations might be synergistic. So that's already happening, and that was made possible by DataShare.
Hi, my name is Barak Berkowitz. I'm a bit of an interloper. My career has all been in digital technology. Got very interested in the difference in how sharing, collaborating works in the digital technology world and the biotech world, and interested in whether there are ways to loosen it up. I have a little, I don't know if it's a company idea, called Agrify, and I'm a fellow at MIT Connection Sciences. And one of the questions I have for you, if I understand correctly, you have one way that anybody can get in the database and basically just look at a broad overview of the data, and another way where you have to put in a research request, get permission from the sponsors, etc. And have you ever looked at privacy-preserving technologies, most notably federated learning, and how there might be a middle ground where people could query AIs that sit separately in each data set and get insights up from there without sharing any data, just sharing insights, and look for correlations and strengthening signals or weakening bad signals?
Yeah, that's something certainly, at least for Vivli, we've considered. We've had a couple of people ask us about that, and that's really attractive, especially for those data sets we can't take in from rare diseases or small data sets. The problem that we've encountered, and really the biggest challenge, is really the standardization. Data sets have notoriously not been standardized enough for us to do a federated approach or distributed computation. And of course, everything has to be exactly standardized for us to do a federated approach.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I don't want to interrupt, but some of the newer federated technologies, particularly in first stage, you do not need standardization if you're having the AI look for generalizations in specific spaces, right? Because the local AI needs to know the data structure. The master AI does not need to know the data structure. It needs to simply aggregate the insights.
Okay, that's a possibility.
But that's something that can also be brought as a proposal, and and an arrangement. We'd like these databases in order to do these kinds of procedures, and the program, the app would be stored on the virtual machine.
Yeah, we haven't really, sorry, we haven't really thought too deeply about that, but it's an intriguing.
Well, just to jump in quickly, we've rather been forced to do that. Actually, I mean, our hope initially was that we would be able to share all of our data, directly. That contributors would want to keep it on our web space, as Lily's done with the JERA study. But what we found is that there are a lot of contributors who don't want their data to leave the premises, and so it's been clear to us that we need to develop federated data tools that are going to allow access to those really important studies, many of them. And obviously there's a way to go on that. With our partners at Iridia and at eValueServe, we've developed a federated data sharing tool that we hope to open source at some point in the not too distant future, so that the community can help us improve that. So federated data sharing tools exist, as you say, and applying them carefully, as Rebecca has said, is a key goal for ADDI in our development now. The other thing that I would mention, and it's maybe less useful, but also a way of getting people access to data quickly for doing things like testing or validating deep learning models, is the use of synthetic data. And many of our data sets right now are available as synthetic data sets. And we're very happy to work with sponsors and data contributors who want to generate synthetic data as part of their offering to the workbench.
Great, I appreciate it. Just to be clear, we're talking about not federated data sharing, but federated learning where data is never shared. So, but if anybody wants to talk about it, I'd love to.
Thank you.
Understood. Part of the same process.
Yes, thank you for the question. Over here.
Hello, congratulations for this initiative. I'm Martin Morency with Perceive AI. We do prognostic and AD. So I've witnessed a lot of initiatives in the past, like I2B2, Atlas, Odyssey, and so on. So data harmonization is definitely always in the issue. I think it will never end. There are standards, NOMAD, OMOP, and so on. I hope you guys have an army of people to make sure that the data is clean and well curated. So this said, I have two questions for you. One is this only available for academic people, or can this be accessed for people from the industry? Like us, we're analytic people. And the second question is, we've seen I2B2 have been very fashionable for a number of years. Now it's kind of fading out. And so what is the future for Vivli? Is it fully funded? Do you have a line of sight on the future? And what's your plan to incentivize more people to contribute data?
There's a couple questions wrapped up in that.
Yes.
So I'll try to remember what they are. But first of all, it's certainly not simply for academic researchers. I'll tell you that the data contributors, whether they be industry or academic, really set the ground rules for who can access their data. So many of them do allow for profits to access their data. And if you look at their research proposals, you'll see that other pharmaceutical companies access other pharmaceutical companies' data or for profits. Not all of them allow it. They do. Some of them do not allow for that. And so it'll be clearly delineated on each member's page what their inclusion and exclusion criteria for access, and it's fully transparent. But many of them do allow for pretty wide open access. So I think you asked for future. I mean, we are a fully sustainable nonprofit, and we have been for since last year. So we are fully funded. And I think that was the second question. I don't know what the third question is, but if you could repeat that.
Your current year is funded, but what about the next 10 years? Do you have a line of sight to this?
I think many companies don't have a 10-year line of sight, but I can just tell you that we are sustainable and we do anticipate being around for a long, long time. Thank you.
Good. But
I don't think I personally have a 10-year line of sight, frankly.
Yes. But anyway, we live in a fantastic times. There are tools for data anonymization. There are tools for governance and all of that. So I think one of the biggest issues is the mythology about the on-prem data. I think there are ways around it, but I think many people think from the past. And that is a major issue. I really hope the community will evolve towards sharing the data and not fearing it anymore, because there are very good governance tools nowadays for this. Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Rebecca, given that we're not able to see anyone in line, should we wrap Q&A and open up the reception?
Yes, let's wrap and take one final question from the floor. We can go right to the reception, and certainly any of you can come see us. Is there another question from online? Did you say that, Bose?
No, we don't have
Okay.
anything online here.
Okay, thank you. So we'll take one more question from the floor, and then we'll go to the bar and serve food. Thank you.
So this
Okay.
this is Malaz Bustani from Regan Street Institute. So we've been dealing with open medical records, and we are now around 200 countries. And we went over the standardization by being very, very flexible and put all our effort in our API to minimize barrier. As you know, the standardization health information exchange almost doesn't exist, but we were able to do intellectual capability of HL7 and all these other stuff. So my recommendation from our own experience is to really go after minimum standard and update it almost every 6 to 12 months, because the speed of happening, and just don't estimate the translator. There's a lot of software that do translation that make the standard almost like language. You don't need now to speak, there's a lot of software that make you translate from English to another language or another stuff. Doesn't require standard. So my big question for you is the metadata, to make sure there's no structural inequity or racism in the data. I mean, if you look at the source of your data, as much as you can maybe link it or tag it with some kind of metadata like the neighborhood, I hope you get some zip codes and other stuff on individual data, so you can see all these behavioral and social determinants of health that, as you know, are much more powerful than even genetic. So if there's any way, do you know if the individual data person has a zip code, at least, that you can tag it to something, or at least to set it up as an aggregate?
So that's a great question. Those are considered fairly identifying. So we don't have that level of identifier.
Can you do a meta on it? Like, can you say, is this cluster from where?
That's a great comment about the need actually for geographic to employ geographic information systems. So this is against HIPAA. We can't use zip codes, and zip codes would have been filtered out of this data. So the geographic codes are probably, the reality is in the industry studies, the geographic codes are probably completely missing, not even sites. But it's probably vital to find ways of
I'm just nervous with this database you will have an AI that's going to do some kind of causal inferences that has a fundamental structural problem. Like, I can tell already, because I know this data, that you have a highly educated people, correct? Primarily white, primarily pure, not much comorbid condition. Right. But the third generation of researchers who will come over here, who are away from the base data, they will forget these kind of things, and all of a sudden create a loop that will lead to a lot of problem that we learn from learning and policing. I mean, the policing issue and the learning started up front, but the third generation of AI start making a lot of loop of inferences. So that's my main concern. If you can somehow create a meta or something within HIPAA to remind people of the generalizability problem. So, because then what happened, you have all these big data and people misuse big data with the truth, correct? That's very, very different if your data is not representative primarily.
That's a really good point, but thank you for that thought. So I know we're at time, so I ask, maybe Lon, would you like to wrap us up for some concluding thoughts?
Well, sure. Just a few mentions. I mean, our goal here was do what we did, to try to introduce you to Vivli, to give you some key words and concepts, to invite you to go visit the platform, and to tell you a bit about how it's, at least the initial aspects of how it's structured, who donates to it, who are members, the kind of data, the kinds of clinical trials and observational data that you might expect to get off of that. We emphasize that industry would typically provide essentially the whole package, same package that they'd give to the FDA, for example. So that's what we have, and we described it, and hopefully you can think of it as either a gift or a challenge in terms of what can be done with it. And then for those of you who are potential contributors, obviously in Alzheimer's disease, this is not nearly a complete data set. There are many other sponsors, many other clinical trials, many academic trials, that databases that we'd hope could be contributed. So thank you very much for your attention tonight. And the speakers.